Hey, Brooke.
Hi, Dee Dee.
How are you?
Good. Get you that nice big A-frame and little room upstairs with all that lighting.
Yeah, it's not truly an A-frame, but it's got it's got side walls going down. But anyway, yes, it's a lovely space.
Fun?
Um, do you mind if I record just in case we end up
Oh
having
no,
a
by all
conversation?
means,
So yeah, okay, awesome.
board away. All right. How's your how have things been going?
Pretty good, pretty
Yeah.
good. It's interesting times.
We're blessed to live in those, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Um,
Yeah. Well, where you want to start? What do you think?
Um, well, I guess so. Two things. One is just thinking about the Rehydrate California kind of concept initiative and where some of your work fits into that. I know you showed up for one or two of those calls, and that was good to hear your voice in there. I would love an update on the Beaver work because I'm Bonnie Rotier. I don't know, or Bonnie Felix
Mm-hmm.
is I've known since I was a very wee child, and I
Okay.
hear a little bit through her of what's been going on in terms of some successes, and then also I'd love to hear your take on the forest issue because it sounds like I watched the gully stuffing video, which is very relevant here because we have unbelievable gullies just right here on my road.
Hmm.
I basically live in a gully, so or on the edge of a
All
gully.
right.
So I've been lightly looking into some of that as things that we might start doing here. But I also was noting that that being in concert with the thinning, which I'm really only. I mean, I live in a forest, but I live in a wet forest, and so
Yeah.
that has not, and most of the work that I did earlier was more on pasture and cropland. So forests are, I don't feel as sure about my opinions or whatever, other than that elemental film was rather convincing about the thinning, which makes sense to me in a number of ways that we need to be very cautious about how that's done or that it's very context specific. But I'm really curious, because I know you've been in this space for a long time, what conclusions you've come to and why. So,
Great. Yeah. Happy to. Well, I mean, I think, quickly on the Beaver front, the high level summary of that is after decades of pushing that with various folks, we back in 2022, our governor through a budget process created a beaver restoration program, Department of Wildlife at the state level, and that kicked off with funding and hiring staff. Worked with one of our local assembly folks and passed a beaver bill last year, which functionally just committed that beaver restoration program to statute through the Congress, through our assembly.
yeah.
Because before it was through a budgetary process on the governor's thing, and so it could come and go at the whims of budget cutting processes. So
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
bill locks it in place. So there's that, and then I mean I think out of that big work is the whole kind of a framework, I guess, in the last few years. I think the fetish and fad of yay beavers, they could,
Mm-hmm.
excited about beavers, which is great for those of us who will claim responsibility in many respects for having initiated the fad. Um, and so I think it's now the game is just on. In every You guys apparently today in Vermont are having a whole meeting. I just heard about beavers and the folks who are hating on beavers and wanting to get rid of them. Uh,
I
Tony and
see, and you know that, and I didn't even know until
Tony
yeah,
Tony said Vermont's Department of Natural Resources holding hearings in Montpelier 3 hours away on beaver damage to man-made dams. So I was texting back and forth with Judah Schwartz and her partner, Tony Lepro.
Mhm.
Anyway, because I sent them that Vermont Land Trust Beaver thing that I just sent to you this morning. I texted you. So, I mean, I think that's super fun. And the rehydration of riverscapes, I think, and kind of the whole low-tech process-based LTPBR riverscapes work that, for especially has really come out of us out here in the West, and folks at Anna Branch Solutions and, Wally McFarland and Utah State University folks and, that whole crew, which we work with a lot and have been in with for a while. I think there's been this interesting combination of that recognition that our riverscapes, especially in the more arid West, if we will, west of the 100th meridian kind of stuff, even though I live in the Pacific Northwest rainforest that also happens to be a Mediterranean climate. So the whole arid, brittle, humid being in the Mediterranean is this weird bipolar.
Yeah.
Our ET and our precip are equal. And that messes with, and when we get to the biotic pump conversation, I'm really interested in narrating that because I think it's a nuance that doesn't comport well with things. But otherwise, yay, we need more water. Let's keep water around. Beavers can be helpful. Let's stop killing them. And so I think that in California, we're the last state really to get our act together on that. All the other Western states have, not that they're all perfect, but they've been at it for a while. So yeah, we got a new program. There's a lot of recognition of beavers as a nature-based solution, as a climate-smart solution. The whole, I think the fun part about beavers, and working in any of these, what we might call intersectional verbs, keystone processes, and species who are somewhat by definition keystone species because and I don't think people articulate this enough, they are engaged in modifying keystone processes, population dynamics or hydrology or fire or carbon or all of the above. And beavers, the great one that's in the mix, it's up in everybody's business, right? The water quantity people, the water quality people, the carbon people, the fire people, the fish people, the people who hate on beavers because beavers are trying to reclaim the flatlands that were beaver habitat before they killed them and drained it and farmed it and built houses on the floodplain and all that kind of stuff, right? So I think beavers are just a fun critter because, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife, in all honesty, that's been one of my biggest arguments with them for literally decades because I started pushing on them formally in the late 90s. About beaver and wilding beaver, is they're in our department. They're the wildlife branch is on behalf of the people of California. They manage the beaver, but what was happening is the fisheries branch, the salmon restoration folks, finally, based on a bunch of science and research from other Western scientists, was like, beavers look to be pretty darn good for coho salmon and steelhead trout and chinook, and so it was fisheries people in the department started getting excited about beavers, and then all of a sudden you get wildlife branch, mammal branch people getting territorial and telling their colleagues, hey, stay out of this, is our we're in charge of this animal. And then the water quantity people, the water rights people, the in-stream flow people, then the water quality branch. All of a sudden you've got this internecine going on because of a fragmented bureaucracy, because you're dealing with a species who is a keystone intersectional species.
Because you're dealing with what?
A species who's intersectional in
Yeah.
these artificial boundaries of how certain bureaucracies or how society creates these isolated, non-systemic, frameworks.
Yeah. Hang
So I
on,
think
I'm just gonna plug something in here that some crackling here. Okay.
Yeah.
You can hear me.
Yeah, the crackling is quit too. It was definitely heard.
Okay. Yeah.
Anyway, so I think, we kind of basically won that war, and we had to assert, and it felt, I use war not a little bit lightly. for some of us who were on the receiving end of the beaver haters
Hmm.
years ago, it was not pretty. Let's just say that it's got to have a thick skin, which I'm happy to have. So at this point, we've pretty much won that one. And we had to do it through historic ecology papers. We had to do it through the science. We had to do it through this intersectional piece. People like Dr. Emily Fairfax et al. And their Smokey the Beaver paper a few years ago on the whole intersection of beaver wetted riparian wetlands and big fires. And that piece is, that was like, oh my God, fire, oh, beaver, and so I think it's been fun to witness whether I don't need the fire people to become beaver believers, but to the degree that they're beaver agnostic and not beaver haters.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like this thing where it's like, it's like the salmon people. Great. I'm all in on salmon. It's just like, by the way, beaver can be helpful, so stop killing them. And
Yeah.
you need to love beaver and have beaver tchotchkes all over your house because you've got too many salmon tchotchkes already around your house. I know this. But and so pivoting those communities to partnership identity versus either just denial or outright hostility, which is what it was. So I think that's kind of the social engineering work that's happened. And yeah, we in California have kind of kicked ass on that, and we're sort of the darling of the movement nationally and internationally of folks who've been tracking how backwards California was for so long.
Mm.
So yeah, we've done slideshows at the big national conferences on how we won, and everybody wants to talk about it and understand the power mapping methodology that we use systematically on this and the community organizing and the
So
pressure.
did you use, so power mapping was part of what you were doing of who's
Yeah,
for us and has power and who's, yeah, that quadrant thing.
exactly. Yeah, we brought together a group of heavyweight characters back in 2012 or 2013 at OAC and explicitly had a multi-day retreat where we went through a formalized process of power mapping and all the identifications of the gradation of basically the question of who can give you the decision you want and who are allies and who are your enemies, or who are the friends of your allies and who are the friends of your
Yeah.
enemies that, in quotes here, the antagonistic, the pro versus con branch. And yeah, like that quadrant thing where you've got left and right and up and down and
Yeah.
least likely to play to most likely to play and that kind of thing. So yeah, we formally and we present the comparative map of that, the 2012 map of that, and a 2022 map of that in our slideshow, and look at who we pushed to the right quadrant of the pro, from deeply lower left anti
Yeah.
denial pro beaver kind of thing, the shift of the map and who's who, and then it also highlights who remains.
And just a question about that. I mean, I know it's different for different people, but is there like a couple of takeaways of like what strategies seemed like were the most effective in terms of the social piece of it?
I mean, I think that information is power. And so the fact that in 2012 and 2013, we in California, I would say one of the biggest barriers to beaver believers, the past barriers in the ecosystem was the pernicious, persistent, in our opinion, myth that beaver were for the most part not native to California. And that is we're the only state that really had the level of beaver history denial because of we're a range edgy state and we got hit like you all in the Northeast got hit early and hard, but nobody denies that beaver were not native in Vermont.
Right.
You had a lot more of them than you do now. In California, there were beaver trappers showed up, but the distribution of beaver throughout the state was what was up in question. They were like, okay, sure, they were in the Central Valley, Sacramento, San Joaquin, the Delta. They're up in the Klamath Basin, which they still are, and they were down in the Colorado, just that little sliver of Colorado that's the bottom end of California. But otherwise, in the 1930s and 1940s, our big mammalogists like Cornell and others were deep into sorting out mammals in California and trying to figure this out. And they basically were like, beaver were not native above 1,000 feet in Sierra Nevada. They weren't on the east side. They weren't on the coast. They weren't in the bay. And there was these maps drawn. So, but then the state from 30 to 50 did all this translocations and moved beaver all over the place. So we had this weird thing where the coast got nuked by the 1790s, 1800s, meaning trapped out by fur trappers, the Russians. We have a Fort Ross in Sonoma County. We have a fur, they took the sea otter for the most part and fur seal.
Mhm.
We're doing 100,000 fur seal a year for a couple of years off the Farallon Islands, right? Like,
Wow.
and all the sea otter, just whacked them. But we did find records of folks trading for beaver pelts in Bodega Bay in 1803 and this kind of stuff. Right? So anything that had fur on it that was tradable was getting poached hard. And the maritime fur trade, beaver weren't centered in that, but I think made a convincing case that the coast probably never was beaver palooza, but there were beaver. So, and then I think that the translocation made things confusing. So that's all to say that we've then published these 2 historic ecology papers in the California Department of Fish and Game's journal.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But it's back in
Yeah.
the Dyer's journal.
They couldn't not see it.
And I think basically at that same year in 2012, when we did the first paper, I had been softening up the other. So there's the beaver aren't native to California, and yeah, they were, except for a few little places. And even if they were native in those places, they weren't most places. And whatever, we moved them all over. So most places they are now isn't where they were native to. And they're still a nuisance and a pain in the ass, and we should just kill them. Right. Like, I mean, that was 70 years of policy in California.
Yeah.
And so one of the groups that, shall I say, took that a mythology hook, line, and sinker, metaphor intended, was the fish community, specifically the salmon community, trout. And they were the biggest folks of like, beaver are bad for salmon. They block fish passage. They block blah, blah, blah. So being a member of the salmon community here for a long time as well, that's my first community other than the broader beaver illiteracy thing was the salmon folks. And so 2012 was a banner year because we both published our first historic ecology paper, and I was given the Golden Pipe Award from the Salmonid Restoration Federation for innovation in salmon restoration by bringing on beaver. So beaver, I had flipped the salmon community in 2012. We had our first paper out, Heidi Perryman and Rick Landman on the Sierras. We did a second paper with more co-authors in 2013. That was more coastal in the Bay Area. And my little beaver flag, where I took the bear off the California flag and put the beaver on, came out in 2012. So 2012 was kind of this interesting pivot year. And then we went and worked the mountain meadow communities. And then we systematically, through the power mapping, took on the riparian rangeland folks. And we've slowly been trying to take on the flatland valley bottom duck club, wetland manager, rice, flood valley, low gradient people, which are the toughest, the delta people, the levees.
So I just want to go back to the golden pipe thing. So you had shown that beavers were actually helpful in salmon restoration rather than
I had been rabble rousing. I had been bringing forward information. I had been integrating pro beaver salmon pieces into my talks at this group. And then because I was specifically bringing the literature down that was coming out of Oregon and Washington, and a man named Michael Pollock was very influential up there. Turns out he's from California, and his older brother and I went to undergrad at UC Santa Cruz together, which I didn't know at the time. And Michael had some of the best papers, and he's a NOAA scientist.
Okay.
And so I in 2009, I was able to cajole the SRF, Salmonid Restoration Federation, folks into inviting Michael to come down and give a talk about beaver and salmon. And that went off really well. And then he got invited down later to be like a plenary keynote person. So it was kind of one of those things where, up front and behind the scenes and bringing in the literature or the folks who, the authors of that literature themselves. So they didn't have to hear it from Brock, whatever, Brock. It's like, don't listen to me, listen to
Right.
Michael Pollock. He's the guy who did the
Yeah.
studies, right? It's like,
Yeah.
so I think legitimizing that through history, ecology, and science. And then I think, and the salmon folks, and then again, it was really about strategic venues of struggle at the geographic landscape level. So picking off coastal salmonids, Sierra Mountain meadows, riparian rangelands, valley bottom wetlands, and urban streams, and tribal, there was a whole tribal nexus. We basically just, parted out the state from an ecosystem habitat perspective, where there was beavers and explicitly significant direct experience and or literature to support various benefits that beavers could provide to the challenges that those systems were facing. The mountain meadows were drying up and incising and dewatering, and it was like, hey, when you got beavers, the mountain meadow's happy. Oh, riparian rangeland, your creeks are incised and the cow's got no food and it's a drought. Hey, what about blah blah, right? So you, again, I don't need the cattle ranchers to become beaver believers explicitly, but more water on the land because of beavers, so you keep cows in the drought and don't got a business, looks really good. And
So
then
how,
we
so
start going
how,
to Washington and Oregon and Idaho and Colorado and finding other ranchers who for years before Nevada, great case studies on the whole beaver thing in Nevada. And we start bringing those folks into California to tell their story to the cattlemen and the Cattlemen's Association and the blah, 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 blah. Right. So it's that kind of game. It's like,
yeah,
and we'll hold this piece as the explicit strategy and power mapping piece when we get over to the fuels to flows in the forest.
right, okay. I'm just curious how, I mean, it's a huge amount of work. How did that all get funded
Mm,
or not?
there really wasn't any money for beaver at OAC that for I'd say for the first hard 15 years of that struggle, at least. It was just just me being a pain in people's ass. And finding like-minded characters. And maybe by did we get any money by 2012, 13, 14, 15? I don't know. Somewhere probably 2015 or 16, we started getting a little bits and pieces, and we formalized a campaign about it. In the last 10, 5-ish plus years, we've been able to raise more money because we're doing more work. And we just got a $2 million grant out of the Department of Fish and Wildlife to create this whole new beaver coexistence program and to teach people about non-lethal coexistence with beavers and hiring folks and working with Beaver Institute out of Massachusetts and doing a training program for certified contractors. And we got money as cost share funding to support land technical training and materials. And so we're out the gate running.
Volunteer or living off of savings, or were you supporting it through other programs?
No, I mean, it was just OAC, the nonprofit I co-founded with others. And I'm just have the entrepreneurial capacity to basically leverage my salary line to be pick and choose what I felt
You
was
were going to work
strategic
on. Yeah, okay.
and do my work and be funded in other ways and still integrate it. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
it's not a lot. It's not a very replicable strategy for most folks. Let's just say
right. No, I get it. It's basically my my thing, except that I'm primarily a one person show. So
yeah, exactly.
yeah.
But at this point, to be honest with you, it's like we are amply well funded and my style at this point, I'm like, okay, great. That my work is me personally, my skill set has been done here for a bunch of years. I'm more on the like, let's come up with the crazy brand new idea,
Yeah,
be a pain in people's ass for a long time, get it going, legitimize it, get it running, staff it up, hire really smart maintainers and creators and folks to get it going. And then I slowly get to move into, just a emeritus consulting status and rabble rouser on the fringes. And I'm still obviously deep into the beaver game, and Kate and
yeah.
I run around and talk and stuff. But at this point, it's like law, and if you can get somebody like Ben Goldfarb to write an award-winning book on beavers and feature your program in
Yeah,
chapter
right.
California streaming, that was a
That
great
was really good.
that was
Yeah, that
a
hooked me in. Yeah.
fact, right? I mean, and so you look at the literature, and I will admit that I I was kind of being a little bit snarky about it in the beginning, but it's like I bristle when I see the headlines of beavers can save the world. And I'm like, quit with the saving the world silver bullet Atlas,
Mhm. Yeah.
carry the world on your back fed. I just generally annoyed with that one. But
Mhm.
beavers, so I'm ironically the one at the Beaver conference going, let's put this in context.
Yeah.
First of all, 70% of the planet is ocean. And 30% is terrestrial. And beavers are only live in the northern hemisphere.
Mhm.
And if we quantify basically the parts of North America and Eurasia that are the surface area of the 30%, we're down in the 10% of the surface of the planet. And then within any watershed area from ridge to river, the perennial waters, the estimate in North America was that 10% of North America was under beaver water at time of contact. So you got to take 10%, right? We're less than 10% of that, and then 10% of that, we're at 0.1% could be under beaver water if we were at a full 400 million in North America again. And anyway, it's just to say beavers are really badass where they're happy,
Yeah.
and that wetlands and beaver habitats are disproportionately beneficial because wetlands and riparian corridors are anyway. But the majority of the surface area of the watershed ain't going to be beaver habitat, never was
Right.
beaver habitat. And all of Africa and South America and also everything south of ain't never was. So
Yeah.
quit with the save the world thing.
Yeah.
Is anyway, that's my little
I'm
my
just
little
gonna close a door that's getting.
anyway, that's but I mean to the degree that if you know doing a presentation, with one of your, for you, one of your audiences, we have a slideshow, and I can truncate that thing down to, you know, 5 minutes or 20 minutes
Oh, yeah. I
of,
mean, I'm
of,
happy
of
to.
how
The
we,
longer the better, as far as I'm concerned, because it's the details that.
or we could do something that would be that Kate and I do together that is just dedicated to the California Beaver story and how we won. And that slideshow exists and we can adjust
Yeah.
it. And I think
Yeah.
Kate's
I
Kate's
think the
valuable to that. So that's like a
strategic part.
standalone story.
Yeah. I mean, the strategic part, like what you were just talking me through quickly, is I think a lot of people have questions that gets at. It's not the same strategy, but there's a lot of wisdom in there of and a lot of experience that you have now about what did or didn't work or what did you have. I mean, I have a bazillion questions I could ask right now, but maybe we'll save those. But about, like what did you have to, maybe I'll ask one of them, like, how did you have to manage yourselves to deal with the fight part of it? Like what work was that so that you didn't,
Yeah.
you know, too bummed out or too angry or too whatever, and maintain those relationships, but not give in or, too much
Yeah.
ass kissing or whatever. So,
Yeah. No, the psycho emotional, spiritual, like energetic part of the work is we're all doing, especially those of us that are taking on seemingly existential and or seemingly urgent and really consequential issues in society right now, whether they're social or ecological.
mhm.
Fire is a big deal. The old English word for Brock is a badger. So I will. That unbeknownst to my parents at the time, that was the thing they gave me, and I've ultimately energetically adopted it as my totem species. So
Yeah, yeah.
I my dad was also in the Marines and
Mhm,
a fairly feisty character. So
mhm.
I'm more or less joined the service, if you will, not the military service, but the service of a fighting for the
The
good.
in service of the service, yeah.
So, but from a pragmatic, strategic organizing angle, the power mapping thing, I think, is a tool that, and we did Kate and I host at the Beaver Con, which is the National Beaver Conference. We have two national ones every year: State of the Beaver up in Oregon, and then Beaver Con, which is newer. And then they've been trying to flip flop back and forth. And so Beaver Con was just in Boulder this last year, and we hosted for the National Beaver Policy Working Group folks. They had like a couple hour working session as a pullout during the conference. And Kate and I kind of led the way on putting together a slideshow of just an introduction into what is power mapping.
Mm-hmm.
There's some organizations that, I mean, this is what they do, and they've got incredible resources online that are very didactic and such. And so I just liberally quoted them and created slides from their work, and then we peppered in how it is that we took that methodology and applied it strategically and with other people, that we invited to these to solicit the input of the WHO towards a roadmap, if you will, in 2012 or 2013 that we then systematically worked our way through for the next decade, which 2022 is when we got the governor to do it, and we basically did that. It was a very
So that initial group, that's interesting, of like, who do you invite in? Because you gotta be people who know, and so yeah,
you
it
gotta
can't just all be your favorite close allies, right?
when you're throwing a party and you're putting names on the who's sitting next to who at the dinner party, and you're engineering an event, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, who's invited to the party or not, and you, yeah, yeah, it can't just be an echo chamber. But in those first meetings, you're not, if there's the folks who are who would map out as the most antagonistic Beaver haters are not invited to the party.
No, right.
But you need legitimate. I mean, so we had CWW, NOAA Fisheries, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NGOs, other affiliated salmon type people who were all allies and friends, and had insight and information into the workings of governmental structures, state, private, that kind of stuff. We hosted a really diverse meeting in that regard. Academia, and they're all people that, at least I knew all of them directly at that point. But they could, they're strategic thinkers who understood what they were being asked to show up for, from a strategic thinking, analyzing, planning, chess, people who play chess and really understand this is a long game, right? Power mapping is a long game, and we're still in the game. We're just, so fun stuff. And then we just got invited to host. The Midwest Beaver Summit is coming up in June, and based on the BeaverCon thing, Kate and I got asked to lead another power mapping exercise for the Midwest people, because they're all. So I think, ironically, what we're mainly being asked to do in the beaver community is, they don't need to know more about beavers. They understand the benefits of beavers. They understand that. They understand coexistence. It's the working in the ecosystem.
Yeah.
That is, as we all know, the ecosystem restoration is the hardest part. Ecosystem is actually not that complicated. And that's what OAC, I mean, all of us who founded it in '94 were community organizers from the get-go. A lot of work in Central America at the time, fighting big fights against the government and authoritarian regimes and things of that nature. Unfortunately, those experiences are coming back to being rooted. So we came from movement organizing frameworks of social, civil, environmental rights as a group. And some of us also happen to be biologists and restoration ecologists, permaculturists. So that's the hybrid of having a social, political, historic consciousness and strategic framework that's also steeped in pragmatic, dirt under the nails reality of physics, chemistry, and biology.
Cool. one of
All
my,
of this is a great precursor
yeah.
for pivoting over to the in the permaculture world. We talk about patterns to details, designing from pattern to detail, but doing from detail to pattern. And so, to the degree that the combo we've just had is a really good pattern conversation, it's a
Mhm.
process conversation. It's Beaver, put that in there. We could transition and put forests in.
Yeah, let's.
and and have a similar conversation about, like, yeah, trying to understand the legacy and the history of relationship to forests and all that kind of stuff, and the current dynamics and these various flows, the history of, at least settler colonist history, if you will. Have you read a book called Forest Journey?
Nope.
The Role of Wood in the Development of Civilization, John
Yeah.
Perlin, Perlin. Great read. Starts with the Sumerians in the Fertile Crescent, Tigris Euphrates Delta kind of thing, 10,000 years ago, the Gilgamesh epic. And the king, who's like, fuck the gods in the forest. I'm the king. We're in charge. We can go in and cut everything down. There'll be no retribution. And, right. So there's the Gilgamesh thing. Super interesting, and the implication of what happened in the Tigris Euphrates Delta, and then it's a pretty fast moving history book around, I don't know, God, the Cypriots or the Phoenicians, the Messenians, the Mycenaeans, the classical Greeks, the Romans, the Cypriots, the Moors, Britain, and then half the book is in North America, U.S., and it basically follows deforestation, desertification, watershed collapse,
Mhm.
civilization transition, rinse and repeat, go to the next watershed, clear cut that one, and it's if when you read that pattern, great read. He's got really where the Trojan horse got dropped off. He's got a shoreline map of back where the shoreline was when they dropped the Trojan horse off, the whole Spartan thing. And then he draws that same shoreline today. And if they had to drop the Trojan horse off today, you'd be 3 miles away because of all the sediment from the clear cutting
Yeah.
of the deposition and the gully erosion. And beavers were never there to save anybody, just to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
So we got to do other things. So anyway, that's all. I think, having worked in the forestry space, so I worked as a biologist. I'm an endangered species vertebrate biologist. That's been my bread and butter, and botany. And so I in California worked mainly in the old growth conifer space, redwoods and Douglas fir, and specifically with a bird called a marbled murrelet, little seabird that last bird in North America to have its nest found in Santa Cruz County in the 80s. And it totally old growth dependent and super endangered at this point, because 97% of our old growth conifers is gone, right? So I think that just to say, long history in working in forest systems and logging and legacy historic extraction and existing conditions, and then salvage logging or clear cut logging or or selective logging, which is kind of what it's referred to in California these days. So I think those methods of uh, quote forest management, or when you hear somebody use the word timber,
Mhm.
you realize, I see. Timber is a synonym for forest as commodity.
Right.
Forest, when it's community, when it's ecosystem, nobody uses the word. It's just like
Yeah.
rangeland.
Yeah.
Rangeland is code for commodity.
Yeah.
Mag soil tillage, plows. So I think in the same vein of industrial extractive land use, whether that's clear cut logging, plow the prairies, or overgraze, and the ultimate expression of it, like so when I responded to you that I was glad to see you put the word thinning in quotes, I guess I would say, if you were going to write another sentence that wanted to talk about grazing, would you put grazing in quotes in the same way?
Mm.
because I think what the nuance here, and a whole piece that I could go on at length about, is really those folks who are ecologically illiterate and don't understand that change is the only constant and disturbance is a non-pejorative state of dynamism. The question is, what do you put in front of disturbance? Are you a degenerative disturber or a regenerative disturber?
Mhm.
Settler, colonist, extractive, capitalist, take your pejorative and put it in front. Logging, grazing, agriculture, plow the prairies, deflocculate the soils, substitution, ammonia nitrate, blah, 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 overgrazing, blah, 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 do the math, clear cut logging. And so I think that in the same way where I think there's been an interesting nascent revolution, and people like Alan Savory, for instance, I think the holistic management, and then other words around planned grazing or high intensity short duration grazing, all of these types of things that recognize there's not a grassland on the planet that's not disturbance dependent, and herbivory, fire, flooding, or some combination thereof, and wind deposition, aeolian deposition are disturbance regimes that those ecosystems have co-evolved with, and in fact are dependent on. And when you shoot all the elk and the deer and the bison off the prairie, and you pull fire out of that system, watch it go to shrubs and
Yeah.
trees. And
Yeah.
you on the Northeast are a great case study of how many bison used to be very deep into lots of parts, and how much of the Northeast was grassland and grazing country, and then pull it off, and how much more hardwood forest there is now than that time of contact. And
And then
success,
we cut all of that down for sheep.
and
So,
then
and
you
then
whack that
we
for
lost a lot of those, soils down
yeah.
in the valleys. So,
And then you pull the sheep off, and now you've got very fast growing, young,
yep.
simplified systems. And so that basic idea that tuning up people to dynamism, disturbance, succession, consequence, causal relationship, that disturbs people, right? Disturbance disturbs people because there's the folks who are not like deep in the work, shall we say. And so I think that in the grazing space, we've had some pretty darn good success. Again, super crotchety, prickly people like Alan Savory, who've, some people love him and hate him. I've been with him in person, and I know, and I think he's amazing. So in his own way, and sure, he's controversial as shit, right? To other folks, if you're the extractors who are dependent on a on monolithic centralization and extraction are threatened, right? And they will do anything they can. What's interesting is so I'm a president of the board of another entity called Sonoma Mountain Institute, and we are leasing about 8,000 acres across a mountain called Sonoma Mountain, which is here in Sonoma County. It's east of Petaluma, or west of the town of Sonoma and Glen Ellen, kind of heading down towards the North San Pablo Bay area. We have a home ranch there of 350 acres, and then we lease all these other ranches. And we're currently, we don't own cows, but we we get paid by other people to fatten their cows up. So we're running a herd of 1,400 animals right now, and we don't keep them in the winter, and we just use them from right about a few weeks ago until kind of the end of the dry season. And we're fattening up people's dairy replacement heifers or cow calf heifers. And we're using grazing as four-legged disturbance regimes with teeth on the front end and excretionary opportunities with liquids and solids out the back end, and a hoof dynamic.
Mobile composting. That's
And,
from Walter
right?
Coleman.
So you're in charge and pooper mache, right? And so, and all that fun stuff. And then the game is just frequency and intensity. If people understand how to play that game, and electric fences are amazing, and virtual collars and all this kind of fun stuff. But that and the interface with fire and carbon and water and biodiversity and grass-fed beef is a whole complex. And so we're the largest. Stemple Creek, Lauren Poncia, and Snow Mountain Institute, we're kind of competing for the largest regenerative rangeland operations in North Bay and top 1 or 2% in the state of California as far as.
What was the second one? Temple Creek and what?
Oh, a guy named, yeah, Lauren Poncia with Stemple Creek Ranch, who's out of Marin, but he also has ground around here. And, anyway, that's all just to say, I think in the same frame as grazing in quotes, regenerative herbivory for multiple benefits, in this case, cows or sheep or goats or another animal, but those are the ones that, work around here. I mean, elk and deer, they're wildland grazers. That's a different question, but, we're in the thick of that as ecologists, as restoration ecologists. And I think the social work there's still obviously tons of naysayers and everybody, but the interesting thing is that and so I often will joke to folks, and this gets to the forest piece. I'm trying to make this comparison because I think it directly translates to what we're facing in the forest. And I think the question you ask about putting up thinning as a monolith, and which is why I was messing with quotes piece, that just like grazing as a monolith or not is a spectrum, and it's kind of the touch too much spectrum, the extraction spectrum is epitomized by CAFO, confined animal feeding operations, being Harris Ranch being like the epitome of the worst of the worst, obviously. And that pendulum swings to the no touch at all movement, which is really strong. The love it, leave it alone, let nature heal itself, get these goddamn prairie maggots out of there, pull the cows off, put a fence around it, make it a national park, and yay. And we did that all over California. And the California Native Plant Society gals who love their wildflower meadows were crying within 5 years when the whole thing swamped out with non-native invasive grasses and it completely drowned it out. And thankfully, the person we just hired to run our Beaver coexistence program, Dr. Gray Hayes, did his PhD at UC Santa Cruz, and I were undergrads together in the 80s there, doing comparisons between grazed and ungrazed using fence lines and doing point plot counts and things and comparing biodiversity, and put some very rigorous PhD science in coastal California to the implication of removal of analog disturbance critters called cows and a no touch at all movement. So so I often talk about Goldilocks grazing, where the touch too much CAFO and the no touch at all, and what's the consensual touch in the middle, where yes in a Goldilocks grazing moment. And that's really hard and it's complicated, and getting it right, and what does holistic management and planned grazing and high intensity and how many animals and when and what time and blah, 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 right? It depends. Oh my God.
That nobody likes that answer. Everyone wants best management practice.
So pivot to the forest, and that's the exact same thing we're facing. Clear cuts, in my mind, my acronym for clear cuts is also CAFO, which is clear cut all the forest out, CAFO. Right. And I push people on this same thing, which is like, so what they showed in Elemental, and I think amazingly well, and I agree with every bit of it, and is that the examples that they were utilizing, all of them appropriately so, because of the matrix they were working in the arid Mountain West, it was Colorado and California were primarily the two zones, were either public lands, Forest Service BLM properties, which I don't know if you saw the news today, but shit's about to ramp back up with we need to get working lands and more timber out, blah, 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 with the new Trump appointee. Or it was private industrial timberlands. And so those are the key words. It is industrial and timberlands. And the matrix that I thought the film did an incredible job showing is a clear cut is a CAFO. And so that they pivoted, because all of a sudden the pseudoscience of forest management through the use of something called clear cutting and the checkerboard pattern, which is based on the railroads, is had shown itself ecologically, hydrologically, economically, in fact, to be a loser across the board. But there's an industry that's militaristic industry, and then the fire folks is a militaristic industry, and all the bombers and the planes and the things and that stuff, and they have common cause with each other because they're a guild of extractors and plunderers in a certain way, which I think the film pointed out really well, of the consequence of clear cutting and having mono-aged uniform stands in a mosaic, and how fire, that the implication of fire behavior of communities in the WUI, in that wildland urban interface. And I think obviously that woman, the study with the towers, the climate change towers, and then she shows up and her towers like completely burned at the base, and then they had come in and quote thinned.
Yeah.
They thinned it to a clear-cut bare dirt like CAFO.
Yeah. Yeah. If you had a haircut like that, you would not be happy. No.
You would not be happy. It's called bald.
We'll take 100. We'll take 99 of every 100 hairs. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the euphemism or the astroturfing of pivoting to the phrase of thinning, quote, thinning, with the heady guise of for fire and fuel load, and we're going to separate the ground fuel from the ground fuel by the fire ladders and make more space. The water manager folks with reservoirs downstream, if you read their shtick on this, they're like more open space, more snow gets to the ground, then it melts longer and keeps the reservoirs going, right? So there's a whole industry that is propping up the plundering of our public lands or our private industrial lands throughout the arid mountain west, the Sierra Nevada, the Cascades, the Rockies, in a big way. And the film totally did that. So why I'm tuned up on this is because then you're like, hey, I saw your gully stuffing film, and wait, it looks to me like you're cutting trees down. You're thinning. I thought thinning. And so all of a sudden now what I've just proposed and I'm looking at is just cast within the thinning guys, and all of a sudden the folks at the John Muir Project, who get a lot of airplay out here. What's his face? He's one of the leading voices. They appropriately are crusaders against industrial extractive salvage logging, clear-cut thinning, and yet they cast so any interaction with a forest where we're engaging in the process of modifying the vegetation density, stems per acre, species, gets put into the hubris of science. Once again, it doesn't know what the hell they're doing, and they just need to stay out and leave it alone and let nature heal itself, because we've so screwed it up because, everything compares to a clear cut.
Right.
And I'm calling bullshit on that. So, and I'm as hyper fluent and have as much experience on the ground of it being done wrong in the same way we're doing grazing in a different way. And so when you listen to what I'm actually saying and you look at the videos and what we're proposing and what we're doing, is thus my little mantra: fewer trees, more forest. We, like you all back east in many respects, have way more trees than we did at time of contact. Trees as nouns, as individuals. But what we do have less of is forest as multi-aged, heterogeneous, layered, complicated forest. And so what does it look like to engage as a regenerative disturber in landscapes that have been plundered and wholly extracted, clear cut, in our forest at OAC 3 times over, simultaneously to that have been fire suppressed. So they're now overstocked with dog hair thickets that are impenetrable to everybody, and stem excluding and dying out, and none of the trees are happy and healthy, and they're disease prone, and then sudden oak death shows up and beetle kill shows up, and now the fuel loads are extra high. So when fire does come, which fire is it? Oh, it's whitey fire. It's the pyro illiterate. And they did a little bit of this, the Yurok folks in the movie talked about how some of the indigenous peoples were lynched in California as late as the 1860s and 70s because they were using traditional good cultural fire. And Whitey got in the Smokey Bear fetish of their pyro illiteracy and said no fire, NO, versus KNOW is no fire. So cultural fire, good fire, prescribed burning in fire-dependent landscapes, of which every vegetation community in California, except for salt marsh and some high mountain meadows and a few little desert communities, is a fire-dependent vegetation community. Full stop. So if you're going to show up here, clear cut the shebang, and then make the first laws on the books literally in the 1850s when California becomes a state after the gold rush, right, which is after the fur rush, which is after the soul rush. The first rush in California was the soul rush, and the missionaries came to save souls. And this is my frame. The soul rush is first, the mission period, then we get the fur rush, then we get the gold rush, and later we get the timber rushes and the soil rushes, and now we have Silicon Rush, Silicon Valley. But that's a whole other side bend of the rushes. That we have these ecosystems that have been so deranged, and the processes that the love it, leave it alone, let nature heal itself mode of the horror from responding to the rape and pillaging moves over here. And so what's the again sort of the Goldilocks grazing? It's like the Goldilocks thinning. So I'm doing Goldilocks thinning.
Yeah.
And we are, again, it's fewer trees as nouns and more forest as verb. And it's basically strategically weeding the garden based on assessing what's the existing, what was it before, and what's the existing stand condition, if you will. In our case at OAC, in the conifer areas we're working in, or the oak woodland, the hardwoods, which for us is 3 or 4 species of oaks and some bay and madrone and things. Is what was it before, what is it now, what happened, and where would we like it to go? And where we would like it to go is to have a mixed, multi-layered, multi-age canopy, which says all big trees. Nobody's cutting any big trees. Anything big, the biggest of the big, whatever big is for your place, wherever your state of ecology is, the biggest and the best get to stay. And then we're making space between them. And we're going old growth again. Weirdly, it takes 1,000 years to grow 1,000-year-old tree. So it's a long game. Thankfully, some of us are sitting on some trees that are at least 100 years in. At OAC, we've got a few that are sprouted up that are in the 60, 80, 90s, hundreds. So merchantable timber is not happening. Board feet, we're not counting board feet on the stump. Nobody's counting cubic volume and linear feet of beneficial biomass that we are thinning out of this matrix to release the trees that will remain. And that organic matter is staying on site as soil sponge, carbon sequestration, upland water recharge, gully incision mitigation, sediment reduction, salmonid habitat, salamander habitat, right? 100% of all our biomass in 30 years of thinning a forest where we had 50 acres where you couldn't on your hands and knees wiggle through the forest because we had a dug fir stem every 3 inches over 5 acres. It's no go. Spotted owls couldn't hunt in it. We limbed and thinned those areas, 20 acres of them back in the early 2000s, and voila, endangered northern spotted owl moved in, and we had a dozen years of them breeding, and wherever they foraged and hunt was in the area that we, right? So it's like reframing that, and so the fuels to flows mantra of slash ain't trash. It's a beneficial biomass. And then basically, how do we in our so that having done this, I got first trained up on stuffing gullies with fuel load mitigation defensible space materials in Santa Cruz in 1989. So I've not missed a year of stuffing gullies with fuel load for
I
30,
have to say, I love the term gully stuffing. It's so much fun to say. So.
right? So the opportunity is do you to the degree that you believe there is an intelligent, humble, yet proactive way to engage with these systems that have been literally scalped and slaughtered and fire suppressed and also nutrient suppressed because salmon are basically extinct.
Mhm.
Whole anadromous nutrient pump and all the NPK and all that stuff
Mhm.
is not coming through anymore either, and they got eroded and their deranged hydrology and their concentrated flows, they're gullying and the gullying's ditching out the uplands and dewatering the hill slope hydrology. So you got a system that's been scalped 3 times over, it's ditched and dehydrated and drained, its food supply's been cut off, and the fire that used to thin it and keep it healthy and run ashes all is not happening. And people are going to walk into that forest and say, love it, leave it alone, let nature heal itself. Oh, but let's keep suppressing fire. Oh, let's not bring back the beaver and the salmon down in the riverscapes below. I'm up
Mhm.
in the uplandscapes. Um, because they're either, I don't know, whatever. They lack a holistic capacity, they're afraid, they don't know what's up, and that's job security for me. That's and people like you, where we get to support I think astute opportunities for participation as agents of degenerative or regenerative disturbance regimes in the face of really daunting odds. Like, and
So,
so that's what we're up to.
so
And
here's where I
our
get.
forests are the most beautiful ones. And anybody walks around OAC and they're like 50 acres, like, oh my God, and the understory and the medicinal plants and the
Mm.
wild habitat. And we've every bit of it. All our creeks that used to run like chocolate milk and kill salmon downstream are clear water creeks,
Mm.
run later longer, leak later longer because they're clear, cold, and copious
That's
for COA.
awesome.
Because you slow it, spread it, sink it, store it in the soil sponge, right? It's called rehydration of California.
Yep. So I love the parallel with the grazing and the forest, whatever you, I don't know what you want to call it. What do you call it? Forest regeneration or,
I think it's just forest, I don't know, forest health is
yeah,
the grant world. The grant world is we get money, federal and state money. The grants are always often referred to as forest health grants.
interesting.
I don't get fuel load grants. I'm not getting fire mitigation grants. Um, because if you get those, now the fire people, Cal Fire, they're the ones in charge of the money, and their worldview between you and me in this recording are the most. They, the campaign I'm running right now, we will dethrone Cal Fire at the center of doing vegetation management
Mm.
ostensibly because they're in charge, and everybody's freaked out about fire because they saw the movie Elemental. And they're like, oh my God, we need to like deal. And I'm like, we need to deal with fire. I get it. And we simultaneously have to deal with water and soil,
Mhm. Mhm.
carbon, and the atmosphere doesn't need any more. And the creeks do. They're structurally starved, and the soil is structurally starved. And there's 33 million acres that the governor says needs vegetation management right now. And the only tool in the toolbox is prescribed fire, and the atmosphere doesn't need it. And I love that scientist, her piece in the film about the amount of GHGs that come from burning is one thing, but the GHG loss from these overstocked young forests that, to be honest with you, have a very high biotic pump potential. The ET coming out of them is huge, as it is in our coastal area. And what we see over here is these overstocked, young, fast-growing conifer, primarily Douglas fir forests, are sucking so hard, their ET, their biotic pump all summer long, at humidifying the air works to the point where the creeks are all going dry. And we're in a Mediterranean climate, and atmospheric a humidification in the summer of a Mediterranean climate is not a rain dominated system. So overstocked high ET forest is a recipe for dead salmon, dry creeks in our current status. So thinning and limbing towards older, more metabolically equilibrated forests that balance evapotranspiration with precipitation, infiltration, recharge.
Mhm.
Towards that for forest recovery for fire and water and salmon is where I'm headed. And that is a biotic pump angle, but to get there, it's going to be fewer trees and more forest. And I'm cutting thousands of trees. And they're all food for the trees that live. I'm feeding the dead bodies of all the trees to the creek and the carbon sponge to feed the trees that remain. And
And
that
how I guess that my big question is, with when you're doing managing of, grazing lands, you the it's over a matter of years, you have a lot of feedback, and even over a matter of days or weeks or months of with forests, it's such a longer term process. How do you know what's working and what's not working?
I would say in the grasslands, it's the same. Like, so we have perennial native bunch grasses like purple needlegrass that have been carbon dated to not on our property, but at Hastings Reserve, Monterey. They're 500-year-old grasses. So the temporal frameworks of coastal prairie and forests are on multi-centuries arcs.
Hmm.
And so the soils themselves underneath there are multi-millennial arcs. And so actually, I think that they may look different. The herbaceousness, because the what is in a prairie is so much underground, is similar to how much is underground in a forest. It's
Hmm.
just forest has got all this charismatic carbon on the top end that distracts us. But that's a
Interesting.
um so I would say in all cases, that's what I'm saying. We're playing a long game. And you look at forest structure and species and how can we, with more art than science, then have less trees towards more forest in a way that is um, humbly pushing that system towards that. And it at a minimum, it starts with, again, the biggest trees around all stay. We're retaining canopy closure.
Hmm. Hmm.
None of the thinning projects, every thinning project if you ever come out and see them here, none of them, I'm not opening up the canopy in any appreciable way
Hmm.
anywhere. We're
Yeah.
retaining canopy closure, and we're basically thinning in the mid zone of the
Hmm.
vegetation. Um, and and then again, all that organic matter, the material that stays in the ground when you cut the stump, all the root biomass, I think is wholly underappreciated. And
Hmm.
as above ground, the slash, shifting your worldview that the fire freak out where haste is making waste, and we need to get rid of this as fast as possible and put it in burn piles and send
Yeah.
it to tomorrow. In your question about time frames,
Hmm.
is that I think versus for me in this forest, the cool thing is my primary place to put all the organic matter, because I'm an upland property at OAC. I have 11 first order upland drainages that discharge off the property. All of them are incised. The entire thing is gullies, 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 right?
Hmm.
So we happen to have a landscape that is highly suited because of both its position topographically, just naturally, it's a headwaters property, and
Hmm.
the legacy of the harm that has deranged the hydrology so much that the stability or lack thereof of our waterways is such that they're incised and entrenched in dewatering and dirty water. So, and yet overstocked. So the arc of my time frame planning on the carbon budget is to invest it into the wettest places with the water cycle in a strategic gully stuffing, layering little lasagna, like the video describes,
Hmm.
and allowing that to compost in situ and stay wet. And ultimately, I have no idea how long that's going to last, but I bet 1,000 years is conservative because we're making a peat bog. I'm basically doing hugelkultur, if you know Sepp Holzer and the hugelkultur movement.
Hmm. Hmm.
We're just doing vertical hugelkulturing in all of the waterways by loading them up with organic matter of various sizes and volumes that then creates a root bed of organic matter for fungal dominated systems where water and sediment bed load transport and organic matter is delivered annually to rehydrate a sponge and re-elevate the channel height and the overall lateral water holding capacity of the hyperrheic waters, right?
And are
It
you adding
becomes a peat bog.
any, are you adding any biostimulants or compost teas or fungal,
It's all,
whatever? Or you're just
I don't
assuming
need,
it's all there?
I don't need to assume. I know it's all
Yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah.
Saprophytic fungus, the turkey tails of the world, and all those guys, they're all just there. And you're just literally taking forest matter in a
Hmm.
forest that has all the biostimulants it's already co-evolved with to eat this stuff up. And you're just rearranging it into a zone and concentrating it there. And I have dug into lots of these gullies, some of which are now almost 30 years old, and they're full of roots.
Yeah.
Basically, it's basically like an aquaponics project. You could see it that way. You could see it as hugelkultur, as aquaponics. It's compost in situ. It's the whole game. And then they just lock it up, and now we get slower water, clearer
And you say
water.
they're full of roots, so things are growing in from the sides?
Within months, the
Yeah,
adjacent trees that you left.
yeah.
So the trees that are like, thank you for thinning around me, for leaving all the organic matter in the roots, for reducing the competition, especially the oaks of the conifers that were cutting through my canopy and overtopping and shading me out and killing me. Thank you for helping me by cutting them out, thinning them. And then thank you for also rehydrating my system where I was basically dying because of dehydration, because
Mhm.
my water tables are lowering because I have a ditch next to me that's incising. And you just put in this incredible brown, green, brown, green, brown, green layer with water and organic matter called a compost pile adjacent to my roots that I now get to grow into and have a year-round hypercarbon saturated soil sponge aquaponics irrigation system.
So what's happening with, what have you seen in terms of the groundwater level right there as opposed to down, like you were talking about, the water managers downstream are, happy to have more water because there's nothing upstream, but what's happening with the groundwater in place?
So they're trying to quantify the water quantity, water budget game is where we need a lot more science. We have one little project that's been 3 years running with paired watershed study with piezometers in an unthinned watershed and one we're thinning and doing fuels to flows and gully stuffing. And I'm filling gullies and turning on switches and kicking water over and reconnecting floodplains and doing on top of flood terrace infiltration with organic matter that's all from forest limbing and thinning and roadside fuel clearance on industrial timberland owned by
Hmm.
Minnesota Company, funded by the state Wildlife Conservation Board, directed by Trout Unlimited on their grant, all done with training for California Conservation Corps staff. And in those piezometer studies that show both of water above surface and below surface in the hyperrheic flow
Yeah.
in an off-stream channel that's dry in the summer, but it connects to a perennial salmon stream. We are seeing that the size of the hydrograph volume underneath is getting wider and bigger, and the amount of water above the surface is getting bigger after the first year of treatment.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
the question is leak later longer.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's the most important thing that people need to understand. And water management isn't just quantity, it's timing of when.
Yeah.
And here, our water cycle it ain't summer irrigation. Everything in California runs by the ocean. And it all comes off the ocean and it all comes from that rainfall that drives out of the North Pacific. And we get an atmospheric river. And in 3 days, we got the equivalent of 15 Mississippi rivers dropping on us in a 50-mile wide corridor, right? The volume of rainfall that these forests in our Pacific Northwest rainforest get. And then I've got 9 months of dry. right? And the game is I don't live in a water scarce area. We live in a storage scarce area. And the biggest storage sponge, as you know, is the soil sponge. And if you can't get it in the ground, slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it, there ain't nothing for the crick or the salmon in July and August, September, until the next rains. So anything we can do, if we're going to quote rehydrate California, it's not, it's the rehydrate is the slow it, spread it. Can you sink it? But the key piece is can you store it so you can share it later?
Yeah.
Will it leak later longer is the mantra. And if it don't, and it, because right now it's like, it's all fast, the impervious surfaces, it flows, we get spiky hydrographs, we read it out, we incise it, we flood everybody out, and a week later it's dry, or a month later it's dry. And so we need the soil speed bumps, the sponges to saturate and hold. And that's what this whole project is ultimately doing.
Cool.
That's the rehydration, right? But
Yeah.
it's the rehydration through elongation of discharge that I think folks, that's the advanced piece for many people. They're like, oh, I see. I need it to leak later longer because the creek doesn't flow in September unless the upland sponge infiltrated in January, held the water and leaks. And that part of the water cycle with respect to the nexus with the soil sponge, my experience is even with professional foresters and blah 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 and people that I don't know why that one's so misunderstood.
Well, I mean, it comes back to what I see over and over and over again is that everything that isn't visible to our eyes, just like you were saying about the roots, right? I mean, like if it's not visible, people just aren't thinking about it and they're not putting it into their calculation, whether it's literal or just kind of mental image.
Yeah.
So once the water's not visible on the surface, there isn't a sense of it's moving underground. It's like it's either on the surface sitting still, or it's on the surface moving, or it's nowhere.
Yeah.
And
No,
that's not how water works, unless you're in a city where everything's concrete, in which case that is how water works.
yeah. And
Yeah.
in the city, they don't even see the water because it's all paved over and it's underground.
Right, going into that's true. It's
And
going.
so that
Yeah,
what we call the pipe sheds versus the watersheds.
yeah,
And
yeah.
people, hydro illiteracy is afflicted with pipe shed perceptions for sure. So yeah, that's the fun part about that is this, all the work is connecting the dots. But I will say that doing this type of work, every permaculture course that's ever been to OAC, I just was in India doing a big project and in Indonesia. So I've done education, got in the gully, and done actual work now on 5 continents. The cool thing is beavers, as I said earlier, super limited on the planet, on the terrestrial part of the planet. Gullies, ubiquitous across
Yeah,
all terrestrial parts of the
right.
planet. I got way more job security with gully stuffing than I do with the beaver program by many orders of magnitude. And I've stuffed gullies on 5 continents at this point.
That's cool.
So the fun part is that right now, because, and I think that Elemental did a great job starting in 2017 through 2020, fascinating window of fire. Imagine the last 5 years, they didn't even pick up those fires. I was around for the Tubbs fire, for the Nuns fire, for the Athens fire, for Walbridge fire, for Dixie fire, for fucking Paradise fire. Like
Yeah,
I know people in that film. Like
yeah,
I
yeah.
read the element, like that film, that part of the first 25 minutes of the film was just re-traumatizing, like,
I know. Yeah.
right. But what I really liked about the film was their piece about the industrial CAFO clear cut thing, and the woman's studies about greenhouse gases and the horror of her seeing her spot after it burned and not being clear cut. Like that part for me was informationally dense that I really
Yeah.
am quoting for people outward. And then the dude who is like home hardening, like quit freaking out about fire in the forest. It's the way we build our houses that is totally stupid. And I've said that for years. And you show up here, green forest with burned out houses all in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And so, and we just did a big home hardening project at our home here, and just we've been touring that around. And that kind of stuff. And it's a really big deal. And that one is the message mainly we're pushing on right now. For me, the forest work, I would prefer not, I don't lead with it as I'm doing work for fire, fuel load, vegetation management, because if you start there, then you get the military industrial complex of we need to do these massively cleared, even shaded fuel breaks, shaded in quotes, like
Mm-hmm.
clear cuts under the guise of defensible space, which is why a group of us did a website recently called Tending the Land in Sonoma County. I can send you, which was a pushback on us witnessing post 2017 fires onward, the horror of people just like rapaciously clearing because of fire fear. So that's why my mantra is you got to take your fire fears and your water woes and connect those with your fuels to flows. And it's the water that's unseen, to your point earlier, that the CAL FIRE folks, they don't think about water. They've got one mandate, and that's fire. The
Right.
water people are over here doing water quality, the sediment control, the fish people. And I'm like, this isn't, we're talking about ecosystems with multiple flows. And I'm as attentive to fire as I am to erosion, as I am to water quality, as I'm into salmon. And we have to manage for all of them simultaneously with every act we do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that holistic, integrated, multi-elemental earth, air, fire, water, life interaction is above most people's pay grade.
Yeah, I mean, we aren't taught to think about all those things at once. We're taught to think, this semester we're going to study this, and this semester we're going to study that, or, in this conference we're going to, one group is going to go talk about fire, and one group's going to go talk about water, and it's like that's not it persists very troublingly.
Yeah, I've always referred to myself as a specialized generalist, right?
That's good.
And so that graphic that is around there, I just put in are kind of two of the graphics we're pushing forward. Just one is trying to actually talk elementally, earth, air, fire, water, life, throw in some conceptual logos of so-called agencies that are managing public trust resources for we the people, better or worse, and what some of their mandates are, and the fact that none of them will achieve their mandates unless we basically work across all of their mandates integratedly and holistically is
Yeah.
the Coastal Flows pitch on that. And then this beneficial biomass portfolio, really, I think is me just leveraging hard on the permaculture principle worldview of stacking functions. Stacking functions with relative, in relative location with on-site resources and blah, 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 blah. That all those permaculture design principles that really pushed you as a designer to be a holistic, integrated, relational thinker and doer. And so my big the campaign, the power map right now is CAL FIRE. Like CDFW was our target for Beaver,
What's CDFW?
California Department of Fish and Wildlife, because
Yeah.
they manage beaver
Mhm.
so right now, California CAL FIRE, which used to be called California Forest and Fire, and then they got rid of forest and they just constrained themselves to fire, CAL FIRE. But they're the ones with all the money and the grants and the vegetation management, the Cal VDP, the California Vegetation Treatment Program, that got a California Environmental Quality Act certification across the whole state as a programmatic environmental impact report so that you can get cost share funding to do vegetation management by the state on behalf of fire and fuel load mitigation. But they didn't spec anything to do with water, carbon, any of those things, because that's above their mandate because they aren't that agency. So we have
So it's
these
just go cut. It's just go cut.
go cut. And
No.
then the only answer they have, because they're fire people, is to teach people how to put it in these little neat piles. They're 4x4 burn piles and burn it. And at some point, prep it for prescribed fire. And as someone who's done a lot of prescribed fire and burned every meadow at OACs back in the 90s when fire wasn't a sexy thing and we weren't asking permission, we just did it. I'm all in on fire. And I'm basically my other target is the prescribed fire. We now have good fire alliances, fire forward, the cultural burning with the indigenous folks. Hallelujah, they're finally getting centered and moved up. And I thought the film showed the Yurok really well that way. Is to say, is to put what would it look like to do compost and then combustion?
Yeah. Yeah.
And lemon thin and stuff in prep for the vegetation management that everyone is doing. There's not a forest out there that people are willing to put plan prescribed fire in without doing some level of vegetation management and modification of the fuel loads and the fire ladders before they're willing to put fire into it. So they're already in there cutting, and the only tool they've got is to pile it up and burn it. And I'm like, the time it takes you in that part of the forest that's adjacent to gullies where there are gullies.
Yeah.
If the uplands and there's no gullies and there's no waterways, then let's do some other creative things with it. But I got a library of photos of people who must have broken their back to avoid the gully, to put the burn pile on the top of the gully and burn it out while they avoided this ginormous gully that they could have literally just stuffed it
Thrown it in. Yeah. Right.
with intention, no, just throwing it
Okay.
in,
No,
like
no, I
the
know.
old
Yeah.
intentional thing for the same amount of labor. And then guess what? They save all the labor that it's going to take to call for the burn window and bring a crew back out in the winter, burn it. So I'm saving them half the money of burning it while we get clean water and compost.
So are they, so, this 33 million acres that they're wanting to manage, right? That they're wanting to thin or whatever they're calling it.
Yeah.
Like, where are you at? Are you in on that? Are they aware that this is an option, or that's your work right now? Or like, because it sounded, from the way that I heard it, it sounded like you were part of that program already, in the sense that it was like accepted that this is what they're going to do. But
No, so the statement that the governor put out last year around the climate smart nature-based solutions, and California is a leader, and that we need to do all this work to meet their climate neutrality goals by 2045 and the 33 million acres and the prescribed fire thing. That's just the governor's statement. And I'm just, as a citizen, as an NGO, inserting and saying, hey, all in on this idea of carbon neutrality and such, and fire resiliency. But it seems to me that you only have one tool in the toolbox, and the atmosphere doesn't need any more of it. And can we have a conversation about this? And so there was no invitations to do that. You have to go knocking on the door and force your way in, which I've been doing. And thankfully, yeah, so I have the ear of the highest up, Wade Crowfoot, who's the Secretary of California Natural Resources Agency. He put two of his staff on. I've had several meetings with them. They've seen all the stuff. We've got a laundry list of one thing California did a bunch of years ago that under Wade's leadership was this it was Cutting Green Tape Initiative. And that's worth looking at. And it basically was like, especially for restoration, salmon restoration, this kind of stuff. What is, instead of cutting red tape, what is the quote green tape, where we have these regulations, but they're actually limiting capacity to move restoration, increase the pace and scale of restoration. It runs the risk of going too far with what we're seeing now with Newsom and Trump, where get rid of NEPA entirely, get rid of CEQA, get rid of the California Coastal Commission entirely. Regulations are the barrier. We have to all get right. So we see how the pendulum go to the clear cut regulations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go to grazing CAFO. They have CAFO for it's a regulatory CAFO. It's the same damn idea. And it's like, no. There's some piece of this puzzle, and some of them need to be modified conscientiously and adjusted. And so I pushed through the first permits in the state to legalize gully stuffing under these water board and CDFW permits. And so meeting with the water board agency folks, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife folks, the resource agency folks, the governor's office of planning and research folks, coastal commission staff. And actually I have a meeting at 11 today with the staff for my supervisorial District 4, James Gore, his lead staff, who wants to talk about this stuff this afternoon. And then meeting with our local prescribed fire burn council, locals on the ground, they also were pushing into the idea of getting prescribed fire accepted. And I honor that and have been the part at the edges supporting that. And so I don't want to stall that movement, but I don't want that movement to squander a once in a generation's worth of organic matter that can solve
Yeah.
other problems.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a lot of what you asked in the very beginning about, like, how do you deal with relationships and anger and and impatience versus long game and annoyance versus and I don't I'll get back to you.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a roller coaster.
Cool. Well, you should probably go get some lunch or something before your next meeting. That was really wonderful to hear that. That was very, very, I didn't know where you were going to go with that. I could tell from your email that there was a lot there. It's very useful to thinking of it sort of in terms of some of the holistic management questions, or, that's very helpful. And also the kind of Goldilocks principle of not too much, not too little. And yeah, and I'm really curious to hear more. I'm assuming you are sort of in the midst of the power mapping with this next thing now, of sort of, or having done that and working through what you've come up with, or.
I mean, we weren't as rigorous as far as inviting, like, 20 people for a 3-day power mapping workshop like we did with the Beaver thing, but it's
Well, you probably already know a
work
lot.
has been happening
Yeah.
for so long iteratively that it's kind of and we think about power mapping stuff, so we have our own strategic power map in our mind. That's who and that's what's been driving who to outreach and the framing on. And so part of that power map was, we need a framework, we need some videos, we need information transfer, we need more technical training. And so all of those pieces of this campaign that are rolling out, and the latest rollout on it, are answers to power mapping needs, information training needs, collaboration needs, that are setting up our OAC's strategies for change, if you will. Our theory of change is demonstration, education, training, and rule change. Right? We've been doing the demonstration at OAC for 30 years. We've been doing the education for 30 years. Explicitly, last 5 years, formalized training with very targeted groups of organizations of people with staff, not one-off individuals. Education, but training, psychological workforce development and training has been happening very explicitly. Fundraising, touring with other agencies and what do you call them? Taste makers, change makers, influencers, that kind of game. And that's all been building iteratively with our first permits and things, and meeting with folks towards the final piece of, which is policy work. And what policies? California Forest Practices Act, slash is listed as a hazardous material. To put slash in a waterway of the state, a waters of the state, or a waters of the US, even under the Supreme Court rules, although everything at OAC is above the waters of the US, so I don't need an Army Corps of Engineers 404 permit, but I need a state 401 fill permit because I'm filling a waters of the state with a hazardous material, and I need a lake bed stream alteration agreement with CDFW because I'm altering the bed and bank of an upland waterway, even though it's dry and it's ephemeral, it's seasonal. So those permits and those regulatory frameworks and that languaging in forest practice rules and things could use some green tape cutting. And that's kind of so we're in the nerdy, wonky weeds part of this. And I'm thinning in the ecosystem. You got to thin the wonky weeds in the ecosystem the same way. And as I often say, that the fuel load is high in the ecosystem and the fool load is high in the ecosystem. And we need some thinning. And that looks like, oftentimes, to be honest with you, the Beaver campaign, a couple funerals and some great retirements.
Mm,
We were stuck until we had a couple really good
Yep.
retirement funeral.
Yeah, we hear that a lot in the farming community. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nothing's happening until grandpa dies or whatever,
Yeah.
dad or whatever.
Yeah, you don't want to bring that on and being crass about it or anything, but
Yeah.
it's social change and evolutionary change, and content is a fascinating thing.
Yeah.
All right, Dee Dee, super
All
fun to
right.
chat with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll email you about scheduling. I would love, if you're good with it, I'd love to use this conversation as a
I'll
podcast.
build off of this and set it
Yeah.
up.
And then maybe we can do a couple of presentations or think about what's most useful to you, really.
I'm happy to, I think a fuels to flows convo and with
Yeah.
some presentation with imagery is a great topic that's got plenty. And then, I think at some point on the Beaver question, if folks are interested in it, I think Kate and I, we have done a lot. We could
Yeah,
use,
I'd love to unpack the power mapping aspect of that. I think that could be useful to many of the communities that I'm working with, of just seeing what that even means. So,
yeah.
yeah.
And I would just, and in both of those conversations, we will center a collaborative effort that we always see with a whole bunch of other partners, both federal, state agencies, and NGOs and tribes, created in California a couple of years ago, which is the California Process-Based Restoration Network,
Yes. Yeah.
PBR network. And so that's part of the power map. That's filling up chess piece that says, oh, we need a chess piece that does this. The rook does this and the castle does that and the pawn, and you need to build the chessboard to move it. And we needed a multi-agency NGO tribal neutral education forum exchange vehicle, and that's network, right? For instance, so that's another piece of this game is
Yeah.
organizing.
All
So,
right. Thank you so
all
much,
right,
Brock.
all
Great
right.
to spend some time together. Talk to you soon.